so much for coming. I'm Victoria Schofield, and I've written a lot on the Kashmiris, Jammu and Kashmir, and I'm delighted to be invited to be in conversation with Dr Nitasha Kaul. It's a real privilege, Natasha. We've sat on many platforms together, but to be talking about one of your books is really very exciting. Now, of course, what we've got here in this slim volume, which I hope you're all going to purchase afterwards, is literature, history, politics, fact and fiction, all rolled into one, and it's called Future Tense. So the first thing I want to ask you is, in particular, the inspiration for this book. I know it comes out of your heritage, I know it comes from Kashmir, but this book at this moment in time.
Can everyone hear me? Is my working? Okay. What's the inspiration for the book? I think it's just that I can't stop thinking and writing about Kashmir in lots of different languages. And by languages, I mean languages of thought. So that is fiction, poetry, non-fiction, academic work. And when I wrote this, it was after 2016, the summer of pellet blindings. So I'm sure many of you in the room know that was the summer after Burhan Mani's assassination, when there were spontaneous uprisings, several spontaneous uprisings all over Kashmir, and pellet guns were used, and people had, there was a mass blinding basically. And I wrote this book in the months after, and it was, strangely enough, always titled Future Tense. So I wrote this at that point, trying to imagine a future ahead, and then when it finally comes out, that's actually just after the August 2019 revocation of autonomy. So it's, so the words Future Tense to me just
Yes, it was a working title, and then it stayed as the title, because I think this is the big question mark over Kashmir, is the future. The thing that interests me is, of course, the mechanism that you've used are several important characters, men and women, and through them what you've done is create certain circumstances which can also be not just in Kashmir, their everyday life. There's a broken marriage, there's infidelity, there's a young love, all of that is bound together. So the big question as a novelist, but how much is this drawn from fact? People often think, or are these just characters that have simply come out of your mind?
I think this would be a good moment to acknowledge, should I use the mic? I think this would be a good moment to acknowledge my gratitude to everyone whom I've crossed paths with, and to all of the stories, albeit in non-straightforward ways, that become a part of one's own telling. So it's a question that I struggled with my previous novel, Residue, as well, which had two main protagonists, and one of the characters was this woman who was an academic, and the other was this young man called Leon. And people just assumed that the woman was somehow me, but the man wasn't, which of course isn't true. So there are bits that are drawn from life, and then there is the factual aspect of many of the things that happened in Kashmir, which are also a part of the book. But I think that one of the main ways in which I thought of this book was really through this sentence of what happens to big dreams on small canvases that are made even smaller by the politics of conflict. And to me, that's like at the core, because as you said, we have all of these things that are happening in everyone's lives, in all our lives, all these various complications of trust, betrayals, revenge, love, care, sacrifice, and so on, and conflict, but in a space where everything is vitiated, is polarized, is fragmented by conflict, all of that just gets a whole new dimension. And I think through the lives of these characters, that is what I wanted to bring forth. That conflict isn't some spectacular, strange thing that only happens when you see people dropping bombs and holding guns and and on battlefields. conflict is something that in places like that, especially, and not just in Kashmir but elsewhere too, it's something that pervades every single aspect of a person's life. It's, it's whether a little girl can have the lamp on when she wants to study at night, or will the convoy or the military around think that that's something, will they knock on the door and will her brothers be punished for it if the lamp light is on? It's little things like that every single move that a person makes or decision that a person makes in a place torn by the politics of conflict becomes always already somehow hostage to all of that.
Yes, well, and you've got one of your central characters who can't go to school, can go to school, whether it's a hartal or whether it's a government shutdown. And there's a particularly interesting passage, and I think the way you've described it, where you're expressing this, the little people and then the big people, and the little people become subjected to the big people, and basically a pawn. And I think you've made a brilliant comparison. And so what I'd like you to do is, and especially for those of you in the audience who might not be quite so familiar with the history of Jammu and Kashmir, is just read that paragraph on page 153, where we're talking about Kashmir. As we know, the state of Jammu and Kashmir lies geographically between India and Pakistan and has been contested ever since 1947. And this is what the conflict really essentially, in a very sort of short paraphrase way, is about. But it's so beautifully written, and it's so loaded, each sentence. And it's wonderful to hear the author read her own book.
Thank you. For everyone else in this room, I must let you know that this is all very improv. So Victoria and I did not communicate beforehand about what I ought to read, what she would ask me. So it literally is that she's asking me things, and I am thinking on the spot of what that means.
Which we thought would be nice.
Yes, so there's definitely an element of improv about all of this. That passage with Kashmir is not in there. Okay. So Kashmir was not India. Kashmir was not Pakistan. Kashmir was not even Kashmir. It was a casualty. Like a woman's body in the wars of men, her body is the land they seek, and when they can't have it, they force themselves. And now and again, here and there, the law lets them. Because the law is of the land, but for the landowners. The little pain of Shireen's own history magnified into the big pain of the big history as a big, heavy teardrop. Then the big history collapsed into its grotesque barbarity as the tears slid down her cheek, and the little history was all that mattered. But the little history is little cared for. Little people and their little pains cannot be seen in the words of treaties and letters exchanged between big men.
I think that's such a lovely way to, almost it is the introduction to the Kashmir issue, and it's a lovely way to have put it. But of course, there's a lot more, as we know, and there's also the aspect of Jammu. And at one point also in the book, you sort of say, Kashmir is beautiful, but when you attach Jammu, can you explain a little bit again for the audience the Jammu and Kashmir? I mean, how do you find that in your story? Your story is about Kashmir, but politically it's also about Jammu and Kashmir.
Yeah. So I mean, again, what this and the successive paragraphs. One of the difficulties I think that I have with trying to read you things from the book is that I don't want to give things away, obviously. And there are lots of things that if I read the next few paragraphs, then that would tell you more than I want you to know right now. But there's many Kashmirs in people's imaginaries, right? Different kinds of Kashmiris and others have different ideas of what Kashmir is to them. There's also then the Kashmir on a map. And it's funny how we can't think of places really, even places we've inhabited, unless we imagine them on a map. But on this map, it's almost as if there are different gashes cut across this territory where people have interacted with each other, commingled, traveled, traded. All of that has now been artificially, in the last few centuries, split into these different areas. And then they have these names. So there's the line of control, there's Indian and Pakistan administered Kashmir, or Indian and Pakistan occupied Kashmir, there are all the specific regions within those. There are nomenclatures matter, so people might refer to it at one part as Pakistan occupied Kashmir or as Azad Kashmir. People might refer to Jammu and Kashmir, and Ladakh might just be included as a part of it. And now, post August 2019, there is a further change in the status of which has separated Ladakh from Jammu and Kashmir. So keeping Jammu and Kashmir together, but Ladakh separate from that. The wider point there is that these are people, these are lives that, because of the way lines have been drawn on these maps, artificially become bracketed into entities and areas that then have different levels of connectivity and relationality with each other. And Jammu and Kashmir is especially strange and interesting. I mean, in just the lines before that, I talk about this character who's reflecting about the fact that how many places in the world are actually named with an ampersand, and Jammu and Kashmir. And then she says, well, she's looking at Jammu and Kashmir with that ampersand in the middle because that's how it's written, Jammu and Kashmir. And if all of the places in the world that have been named with an ampersand have these similar troubles, because it's the way in which things are bracketed together and you bring entities into being. So Jammu and Kashmir is always written like that. And then if you go to say Srinagar, you would see these souvenirs being sold, and this is something that later in the book is referred to. And these souvenirs don't say Jammu, they say Jannat and Kashmir, which means heaven and Kashmir. And it makes you think in all sorts of ways, like what's the significance of taking, does that mean heaven is not Kashmir? Or does that mean heaven is only Kashmir? So it's all of these curious ways in which the names of places and the way in which they are marked on maps have a very real effect on people's lives. And that's just become ever more pertinent now, now that Jammu and Kashmir have been kept together as one union territory, and Ladakh has become this other union territory.
But you also do say that how can somewhere be heaven when it's a conflict zone? So there are all these conflicts within conflicts. You mentioned, Natasha, that your inspiration was obviously the summer of 2016 and the pellet blinding, and also the death of the killing of Gurramwani. But one of the things that struck me in the book, and again, I'm not wanting to give you any spoilers, but we have got a few little episodes here that I think are very interesting, just to whet your appetite, is the 2017 Human Shield, which, again, I think that's pure politics. It doesn't have to be fictionalized because it's fact, and yet you've managed to weave that into the story, ending with this very powerful statement. She's sort of wondering, it's Shireen again, who's wondering how this could possibly happen in the civilized world. And then, again, you're extending beyond the conflict into further conflicts, giving this reference back to the Second World War. Then she realized that humanity lived in a world where the Holocaust was not even 100 years old. And again, I think this is what is so special about the book, is that there's a lot of depth in what is otherwise a novel, but you've managed to incorporate that. And with this event, we've got all the different characters. One is praying, another is writing poetry, another is writing to the newspapers, and then the other one is just thinking about it. And she's the one, Shireen, who thinks about this. That this is comparable with the Holocaust. So again, how important was it for you within the novel to root some of the narrative with factual events that people would identify with?
That was definitely a conscious choice. So the Human Shield incident was where a Kashmiri civilian was tied to the front of a jeep and used as a human shield, and the army major who did that was awarded for his bravery. And that incident and responses to that some characters, in particular a character called Bichor, which is Kashmiri word for helpless, plays a central role in the book. So it was, I think, going back also now to think of what you asked me before in terms of inspiration. There were things that so there's something that happens, like the human shield incident or the pellet bombings or whatever. These kinds of atrocities that very non-linearly keep happening every few years. But it's the way in which various kinds of people who are part of that, or who are witnessing it, either personally witnessing it by being there and then, or just witnessing it through hearing about it, or witnessing it through their belonging to a place. How various subjectivities within that react, and so how do the women react? How does this character in the tour, how does he react to what's happening over there? And I think there's just there are instances that two people who follow Kashmir, they would spot other things as well that you may have done as well that are drawn from life. So, for example, the idea, this human shield incident, but also other things like the boatman who drowned trying to save the Indian tourists. That's something that really happened. Things like that, which are very much, or the small child who goes to offer. So in the aftermath, when there's lots of people in the hospital and there's a shortage of blood, this teenager who goes to the hospital and he offers to donate his blood in order to help the people who are injured. And the doctors refuse to take blood from him, and they say, well, you're a minor, we can't, you're not old enough to donate blood. And there's this strange irony, paradox of the fact that the people who are being shot and blinded and killed are also children. They are also minors, exactly the same age as this person who's wanted to give the blood. But but they can be shot, or blinded, but they cannot be in this position where they can offer blood. So it's all of these things are all actually all real life.
Yes, it's real life, but it also displays the contradictions. Now you've also got backstories, which again you reveal, because your characters, you've got several characters that feature throughout the book, but then gradually you reveal their backstories, their background, and I think again the chapter that starts with the death, you can describe death so many times in Chinese. Can you again, it's just that it was an extraordinary it suddenly took you by surprise. It was suddenly thinking about the concept of how you would describe death, but it's a very powerful way and a mechanism. How important was it to you to get the backstories in so that you would build up your characters and their lineage, really?
Yeah. Yes, and so what happens in the book is that there are these characters, and there are different kinds of Kashmiris, which means that some of them are from different parts of Kashmir, or are Kashmiri Muslim or Kashmiri Hindu. And the reason for their different ways of belonging to Kashmir, the reason for those different backstories is that actually does create different narratives and different politics when they come to interact with each other. And through those interactions, there's also, of course, the possibility that there's friction and learning both. From knowing that, as the famous Kashmiri American poet Aga Shahid said, your history gets in the way of my memory. In effect, one could say that we just call memory time. We cannot actually think of any time unless we associate a memory with it. So all of these memories, these caravans of memories that different kinds of Kashmiris have, that they're carrying with them all the time, when they interact with each other, there's that friction, potential irreconcilability, but also the possibility of knowing other stories and other lives and other ways of belonging to that same territory. And that chapter specifically, so the book is not, there are 3 sections to it. The first section is called What Happens,
sorry,
what happened before.
What happened before, then it's what happened,
then
what happened after.
Then it's what happened after, and then it's what happened next.
Yes.
So it's non-linear, and slowly the stories converge. But that second part, so you have this first section, and then the second section shifts to what happened before in order to get back into non-linearity. And that's the one that Victoria is referring to, which starts with this young girl who's just learned of her grandfather's death, and her grandfather worked, she's Kashmiri Pandit by birth, and her grandfather worked for the intelligence services of India. And so she has a completely different inheritance of memory and of belonging than the other characters which we have heard about in the first part, who's a Kashmiri bureaucrat, Kashmiri Muslim bureaucrat, who works there. So that what happened, the fourth section, begins with Shireen talking about there are 60 Chinese characters for death, 60 Chinese words for death. Too few, Shireen thought, because when someone died, there are at least 1 million ways not to be able to express what you want to be saying. I'm just saying that from memory, but I'm sure there's a book somewhere where that is actually written. There are 60 Chinese words for death, too few, Shireen thought, because when someone died, there were 1 million ways not to be able to express what that death signified. Okay, I remember all of that.
Yes, no, you did. Yeah, but I think again, for all of us who love words and who love literature, one of the aspects is you have to dwell on this, because in a way what you've done is put, for us, these feelings which we all will feel in a certain way, but of course it's more poignant because, as you say, it's an area of conflict. But as I sat reading that passage, I actually almost read it twice, because I just thought, well, how true that is for anyone with bereavement. I mean, then of course you obviously go into the actual story, but I think that's one of the richnesses of being a poetess yourself. And so the next passage I'm going to ask you to read is on page 15, and please read it slowly, because this is at the beginning of the book, and it features one of the other women who's called Zeenat. But I think you're not racing through the story. It's one of these things you have to savor every word of it, because you've got the description, whether it's the food that's been eaten or the weather, the climate, the outside. But I think this passage in particular, which starts autumn deepened, is to say, it's the mark of a true novelist and a true writer.
Zeenat has left Fayaz. Fayaz is a bureaucrat, and amongst other things. Also, at the start of the book, we realize sort of a failed person. And Zeenat's just left him, and she's gone back to her parents' house, and where she's just met this little child she hasn't met this child before. This child has been left there by the village gravedigger because his parents have died. The child is deaf mute, and so there are these two people who have very little to be able to express at that point in time. And over the next few days and weeks and months, as Zeenat is settling back into the village, and autumn, and it's autumn, so there are a few lines there that I'm going to read. Autumn deepened its palette outdoors, spreading a chill on the ground and setting fire to the leaves. On windy, rainy nights, when sleep would not come to Zeenat, she would turn out the lights and lie down, only to spend hours staring at the droplets threaded through the cobwebs, suspended from the wooden eaves alongside the braids of wires and the naked unlit bulb. Everything she saw told her the stories of currents in eons. The spiderwebs hung from her very soul, and she was ever so surely consumed by the woodworms of a wasted life.
Thank you. I think it's just it's the richness of writing, which I'm sure all of you literature students aspire to be able to do. So the next question, Natasha, is how difficult is it to write? Do you get writer's block?
Not really. I have, how difficult is it to write? It's very difficult to find the time to write. Because to find the time to write is not just any kind of time. I think writing time is a special kind of sacred time.
It's not any kind of writing either.
Yeah, fiction or poetry, but specifically non-fiction. I feel like my biggest struggle is to be able to log out into that time. And for me, every time I write, concentrate on writing fiction, I just struggle to turn off the world. For example, what I don't want at that point is to know any clocks. So I take out the batteries out of every clock within sight, And the thing is, I realized, like on an iPhone, for example, on a phone, you cannot now anymore turn off the timer. Did you know that? You cannot turn off the timer. So I actually set my phone after a lot of struggles. Like computer, you can make it disappear. So I set it to Newey Islands time, you know, the Baltic time, whatever. Yeah. So some totally random time near the international date line, so that when I looked at the phone, I did not really know what time of day it was. And in England, of course, it's brilliant because the sky will tell you. And so it's really just a way of getting into that rhythm of meaning making with you sleep when you are tired and you wake up. It's almost like a past time where you're not governed by the clock. So you write for as long, and it doesn't matter what time it is on the clock because you don't know. So you just write till you want to go on writing, and then when you feel like you can't, or you're hungry, or you just have to drop into sleep, you do that. And so that's for me the really difficult thing, which is hard to engineer on that island of
to find the island of time. That's very interesting because sometimes people think that you writers say, right, well, I'm going to write for 4 hours today, and I would always find that sort of a very difficult thing to say, because why do you suddenly stop the clock at 4 hours if you're writing really fast, and you can't just necessarily turn it on and off. So I think yours is quite refreshing.
That's maybe revision time. I mean, when you have to, so then you leave what you've written for a bit, and then you come back, and yeah, that sort of discipline, then that craft part comes in. But I think that for the part of creation, that you have to give yourself a space, a fairly unrestricted space to be able to think. And one of the other interesting things is, personally, that I find interesting is, where do you leave that sentence where you think you know what that next sentence is going to be the next time you begin, or you leave it at the point at which you don't know. I mean, I don't know if this makes sense. You know, it's like the next day you want to know whether you know what you're going to begin with,
yes,
or whether you actually don't know and you just go back to it and it can just take you anywhere. And I think that freedom of thought that fiction allows, it's pretty unrivaled, because you can actually plumb, areas of cognition or memory, and things just, they just strike you that you wouldn't have thought.
Yes, so I mean, my next question after that was how structured, how planned with your various, do you know what the end of the book's going to be when you start it, or do you just allow a kind of free fall that your characters will lead you in the direction that you want them to?
So I write linearly, in that I may later change the order of chapters if I wish to, but I think that I write knowing that what I'm writing is the first chapter and then there's a second chapter, and I have an idea of roughly what I want to convey with this story and what the characters are going to be, but I don't always necessarily know the exact end. And so as I write, it could happen that I would have, and it did happen that I would think that, no, I want to sort of, make this person or this character
do something different
than
yes.
I thought. Because they have their own mannerisms.
Yes.
Like Rehan, for example, keeps having, this journalist, this Kashmiri journalist, he keeps having backaches, and every time he sits on the jetty or the thing. So it's then they begin to develop a personality of their own, and that then also
gains a sort of momentum. And do you find it easier when you're writing the female characters than the male characters, or are you used to interacting in... So I was very struck with this book that we feel we really get to know Zeenat first, but then we leave her to one side for quite a long time actually, and then we get introduced to Fayaz and his friends Gul and Rahan. I'm just, as I say, again, it's a medium for writing that it must be sort of quite difficult, or are you more empathetic, I suppose, with your female characters than with your male ones?
So structurally, in terms of the way the different characters intersect, etc., I find the metaphor of a delta or tributaries of a river really interesting, or symphonies, things where strands come into something, and then and the whole is like, there's things that come into it in non-obvious ways. There's an element of how things come together to make sense in different parts of the story. So I find the women characters easier to write. I don't know how I feel, what I would want to say to that. No, I don't think so. I don't think that I have. No, I mean in the third part, for example, I feel like if I saw Victor, I would know him,
Yes.
even though he's a a young boy. No, not really. I don't
Yes, I
think
think
so.
that's
But there are things, of course, that that I would be able to put into a story. I think, for example, it's always struck me like, why doesn't any female character in so many of the novels that I've ever read ever have a period? Why doesn't anyone ever have a period? And why doesn't that ever upset anything that they're going to do? So I thought, there has to be, she must have her period, it must be a week early, and it must somehow really upset her and make her short-tempered. Because that happens, that's part of life. So in that sense, I think that experience matters. I mean, there's obviously empathy possible in imagination, but I feel like there are some very kind of obvious ways in which I think lots of elements of reality, especially like when people are writing female characters, are not part of that story. So I did want to, I did want to have her, her have this exchange with her boyfriend, because she suddenly started bleeding and this whole thing has just come at the totally wrong time and everything. So yeah, so I think that sort of stuff.
It adds to the authenticity. It rather reminds me when I was writing military history, I was desperate for somebody who had toothache, because I couldn't find anybody who'd had toothache, and I somehow felt that my narrative needed to be authentic. By, some they never seemed to write in their diaries, and they never were going off to the dentist. I thought, were there any dentists? So I understand that. I think it's, so I suppose it's the authenticity that you're striving for with fiction. Oh,
I don't know, I think I don't know about authenticity as a word. I don't really agree with the
but you want your characters to ring
I don't
true.
think there is an authenticity. Nothing's drawn from a fact which we can have some kind of unmediated access to. I don't want them to be authentic, I just want them to be various. And I want there not to be this kind of enforced facade of everything just going to plan all the time, because that's not life. Things don't always go to plan. People sometimes don't always have the worst intentions, but things turn out badly. People miscommunicate without wanting that to happen. People say things they don't mean, and sometimes people, very fallible people, especially in the past, statesmen people, do things. Have conversations where they sign things that then bedevil entire, millions of people for decades, if not centuries. That's all real. It actually happens like that. They're not. So I feel like there's all these. There's almost as if this larger than life idea of history as this thing, this facticity. It's that, but it's also very kind of you can break it down. You can disaggregate it. It's actually a lot of. There's a lot of
Yes, there isn't a great master plan. I think that's what we're, and I think in a way that's what I mean by the authentic. I mean, it's just a way of using the word, but I think it's that you feel you can. It's not all just a sort of a chocolate box that has just been put together and is all perfect, because life isn't perfect. I think on that note, I'd love to have some questions from the audience. I mean, I can carry on indefinitely, but I think it would be lovely to have your questions and any comments you may have if you've already read the novel or anything you'd like to say. Don't be shy. Yes. Are you a student? Maybe say what you're studying.
I'm a student. No, I'm not studying English actually.
We have a mic here. I think we can hear you. Yeah.
I came here with my friend. It was very last minute. I'm actually a medical student at UCL, but my family is originally from Kashmir, and I just wanted to ask whether do you see any similarities to other world conflicts, or what do you think about how Kashmir is often compared to other world conflicts? What's your opinion on that? Do you see similarities or do you see differences?
There are similarities and differences both, I would say. I mean, in the book, for example, the mention of Hong Kong keeps coming up, not in a straightforward way, but Hong Kong is one of those places that features now and again in the book, because of the past, that an aspect of the past of this character, but also because of the way in which conflicts elsewhere are also have similarities. I think at a very distilled, in a very distilled sort of sense, there is a way in which conflicts are about things that are, similar in terms of reconciliations not being able to happen, facts being disputed, vested interests playing a role. All of that, I think, is the case in any conflict.
Yeah. Yes.
I'm Shelza, I'm also a student. So I wanted to ask, you earlier spoke about maps, and also there is this need for academics to define and categorize things, for example, this into rebels, revolts, uprisings, and everything has its features and ingredients. Does writing fiction help break away from those categories of writing as an academic?
Very much so. I think that it's a freer form of writing, and stories have an appeal that I think it's kind of almost primeval, right? When we hear a story, we are able to see things from from different points of view, even if we do not agree. So I feel like fiction allows you to do that. It allows us to imagine what if. It allows us to imagine, how things might be otherwise, and yeah, I mean, it draws the pain, the memory, all of that can be a lot more immediately and viscerally conveyed through, I think, the stories. Because words really are powerful, and whatever we write and say as academics, and that is important, and I think that there is all of these different languages are important, languages of thought and expression, but just the but stories are, I feel like those words, they just have a power that is things like when he talked about the ideas of great statesmen or we're always acting on ideas. And that thing that moves in the head of anyone who may have the ability to exercise power and affect lives, it ultimately comes down to those ideas. And those ideas are parts of things that they have internalized through what they've known, through what they've seen. And why have they seen that? Through the categories, through words. And fiction, I think, is really powerful in that sense.
Yes, I think it's more uninhibited in a way than the fact. Yes, this lady.
Do agree with Victoria that you've sort of built the character very beautifully, much more than Fayaz. That's the question. The question is that being a Kashmiri, I've lived my life in Kashmir in the 80s and 90s and now in 2000. So every decade in Kashmir has its own significance and differences. So how 90s were marked by crackdowns and other stuff, and how 2000 and onwards, there have been public uprisings and everything else. So I wanted to ask, has it been challenging for you to sort of look at different frames, in Kashmir, not having lived there from a distance, and like you said, there are different ways of belonging, how you actually live in the place and how you identify with the place and hear stories and read about them. So the question is most likely this, that has it been challenging to create different times, and what is the relevance of this future tense? Has it got something to do with different times in Kashmir, or it's just general?
In reverse order, future tense is just it was always the title because the book was written into the future. So it was written. So if you look at the timeline of things happening within the story, there are things in the story that happen a year forward. So that year hasn't yet happened at the point at which the book was written. So it was always written in a contemporary sense in the post-20, there are instances, of course, 2014, etc., that's referred to, but it's essentially like 2014, 2016, written forward into time. So that was always the title because it was writing possibility. And the thing about, I think the distance gives perspective. I think that when we are on a mountain, we're part of that mountain, but as we are away from that mountain, we can see things not necessarily better or worse, but we can see the contours that we may not have been able to see exactly the same way if we were there. So in that sense, I think the apathy, I'm just trying to think of that thing, the various ways in which there's apathy, there's anger, there's collaboration, there's corruption, there's resistance, there's betrayal, all of those things, and the way in which all of those different characters in whatever they're doing in their lives, they're marked by that conflict. And I think that distance, but also a kind of, I think, near distance, because almost all of the things that are there are places or situations that I've seen, that I have been a part of. And I feel like that shift in perspective, I think the really interesting thing in thought happens somewhere between zooming in and zooming out. And because that's where you're kind of adjusting perception. I find the camera to be a really good kind of metaphor to think about that. So I feel like because you're putting those things together, the micro and the distance view, and in that sense, I think it was useful for me to be able to see it from the outside, but also to be someone who's going there, who's living there, and for periods, and then coming back. So, yeah.
Do you go to 1980s and 1990s? Because in the beginning, the last flood said 13 and 14 and 16.
Yes. Actually, it goes way back to 1947 and probably before. So it's but not in a direct setting of the story way, because it's a story set in contemporary times, but in terms of the things that have happened in the past that are either playing a role in the present or that are part of the characters' memories or inherited histories of the different characters.
And the backstory of the previous individuals. Got to read the book. This gentleman here. Yes, you. Yes. You have this.
So, hi, Natasha, you alluded to this in your talk as well. So there is a ever widening gap between the narratives of Kashmiri Pandit community and Muslim community, and this gap is exploited by the Hindu right wing, as we have seen in the recent Delhi elections. Most sensible voices from both sides would blame Indian state or failure of Indian state for their sufferings, but do not acknowledge unconditionally each other's sufferings. Do you think there is in the future there is a chances of reconciliation between the two, and basically lending more support to the struggle itself by coming together from both sides? Is there a chances of that happening?
So one of the first people that read the book, he said to me that he found that this was much less bleak than many other things that he'd read. So I'm a person, I think that I have this here, not because I brought it for this reason, it always stays in my bag. But today as I was rummaging for a pen, I just thought I'd keep this out here. It's a stone. Stones mean something very specific, I think, in the Kashmir context. But also it says hope. So yes, hope is something that I think hope is a really interesting forward, always moving forward kind of adjusting virtue that you can, it's one of those things that is really important. I am not a pessimist, and I think that it is always possible. It should always be possible with better stories, not just fiction stories. I mean, with better tellings of experience and conversations. It should always be possible to move forward. And so, although you mentioned the Delhi election, they did lose, right? The BJP lost. So it is the thing about the politics of hate or divide is that it seems really unsurmountable. And of course, in a sense, it would make perfect sense to despair about the state of the world today. But alternatively, one could also think that despair should then again, there's a kind of despair and hope are basically two sides of the same any situation. They're just twins in a way. So I would say it's always possible to imagine better futures and to work towards them. And stories are again really important. I feel like a lot of hate and indifference is sustained through abstractions, through not encountering other people as real people. And stories are important because they allow us to kind of break through that that abstraction and to say there's tragedy is real no matter who it happens to. So yeah, I would say yes, I have hope. I know these are terrible times, especially with everything that's been going on in the last weeks and months, ever more. It's accelerated brutalization, but it should always be possible.
And I think if one doesn't have hope, then, as you say, it's the other side is despair, and you might as well have hope. You had a question?
Yes, I'm Hannah, Natasha's colleague, and my copy is waiting in the post office at home. So I only have the cover to go by, and I see that the cover image is attributed to you, so can you just, it's very striking, and this crow on the front, and I'd like to know its significance to you and the book as well.
So this is an image from the Dal Lake, which is in Srinagar, and it is, and there's, so towards, there's bits that's not very clear, but those are houseboats all along there at the back. They're very famous, you can see them, and that is a shikara, that kind of boat in Kashmir, that's called a shikara. And I think I took this picture in winter 2017. I had a lot of communication with people who were designing, I had the image, but with people, what precisely the design ought to be. And again, the color of red was, now of course with the stand for Kashmir and everything, red is a color with significance. But this, the idea of this being red it was always going to be red. And the text is all, those things are meant to signify barbed wire. And because that's something, I didn't want an Orientalist sort of cover that would say, oh, beautiful place, or, a chinar leaf. In fact, at one point there was this idea of introducing like chinar leaf as in the backdrop of the chapter numbers, but that was dropped. So it's meant to sort of convey that possibility of flight, but also of suffocation through the barbed wires, because that's very ubiquitous, that's everywhere there, the idea of barbed wire. Okay, really doesn't like being commented on.
Yes. Oh, and the bird at the top of the flight is the bird at the bottom. Yeah.
Yes, it's like, I think it's just serendipity that's in flight.
Yeah. That's a good question. Yes. You had a question? Yes. Yes, you.
I think it was me. Yeah. Thank you very much, Natasha. It's a brilliant poem. I haven't read the book yet, but I'm so looking forward to it. But based on what you have said so far, I could draw certain parallels with the Kurdish context there, because the human shed, when the soldiers put people in front of the panzers or military vehicles to clear the landmines and sorts of things, is quite similar. But the question I have is this: first, what is kind of overall argument here in terms of hope, or in terms of, what is the book about? When I offer it to somebody or recommend it to somebody, what should I say that you will get from here? And the second point is that the note that by Andrew Whitehead, it mentions the modernity and traditions. You have talked about other things so far, but if you don't mind, please, if you can say a few words about the trajectories that are mentioned there in relation to modernity and tradition. What do you mean? What do you deal? How do you deal with these things?
So the overall, I guess, the overall point is the idea of how people's dreams, that a person might want to be an engineer and build bridges, but instead they die a painful death, right? So because of the context that they find themselves in. A person may have, a certain idea of what they're going to be doing, but something cuts that short because of that very vitiated context in which they're living. So the overall idea is that in a place torn by conflict, the canvas on which you can dream of a future is just shrunk really to kind of, it's a very small canvas. So it's the way in which these lives of these characters are affected by the conflict, and of course they're intersecting. It's non-linear. So in the first part, as I said, there's the story of Fayaz, who's this bureaucrat, and his wife Zeenat, who I read a bit about. And then his friends, so these three friends who have grown up together, a policeman, a journalist, and a bureaucrat. Like that's what they grew up to become. And then there is a nephew, Fayaz's nephew, who's a young man who wants to be a cricketer, but can't under the circumstances, and ends up doing something else. So that's one part of the story. And how it intersects with the other section of the story, which are these two women, Shireen, this woman whose grandfather, whose grandfather has just died, that's where the story begins, and her friend, Saima, who's originally from Kargil, who studied to be a bureaucrat. And obviously there's a connection between these two stories, these two different sets of characters. So the two men, the men in the first part and these women. And then the third part is just, that's a mystery that you have to read. Because then stuff happens when all of this gets together. So you have to, that's the chemicals, that's the ingredients. But when you put them together, something happens, and that I cannot tell you. You have to read it.
The reason I asked is that sorry, I thought.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead. No, please.
No, I thought because it's obviously a political text.
Yes.
Yes. So that's
very much.
What is in relation to future and both.
Yes, it is definitely political fiction, and that the political part of it is and I think that's the bit that also applies to other conflict situations. This idea of how entire populations can be bartered, besieged, brutalized, and how their lives are hostage to so many things that are totally not in their control. That's the broader thing, and those histories, those inherited histories and tragedies are suffocating them. And what are the possibilities of moving on from that? So that, I think, is something that is common to every situation where people live under situations of exile, militarization, and a whole host of other problematic memories, collective memories that they've inherited.
I think the section that we referred to with the little people and the big men, I mean, I think that you can apply, you change the names, but that's applicable to other conflict zones because little people are inevitably the casualties of big men, who live there. Yes, you have a question?
Yeah, sorry, it might be a bit of a weird question, but I'll just ask it anyway. When it comes to the writing process, and as someone who has a direct connection to the region, when you hear about heightened incidents of violence, how does that affect your writing process? Does that kind of push you more to get your message across, or do you find that your kind of emotional responsibility you have to take time away, or how do you respond to this kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really just depends. There are times you hear something really distressing and you just end up crying after dinner. And you look at the sky and you hope that tomorrow will bring better news. There are times when you're in a context where you're able to write something and you write, and that just may be like an article. Because you want to kind of step back and analyze what's really happening. And there are times when you want to maybe tell a story, and these are all parallel, coexisting, concurrent kind of situations. So there isn't one way in which one reacts to it. It really depends because the personal, the political, the internal, external, immediate part of it, they're also kind of entangled with this imbroglio that is a person. So there isn't a way of reacting to it. But there are things like, for example, as I said, the Himanshu one, that there are instances that for one reason or another one wants to kind of reimagine into a story for to make a point.
You had a question. This gentleman here, and then that lady, and then you like it.
How much time have you spent in Kashmir, and how close to reality some of the stuff is in this book?
I don't know how, if I could answer that question about how close to reality it is. I mean, I suppose, as I said, there are instances in it that are real, but nothing in a novel is straightforwardly real, right? If I speak to 5 people at the end of this, and maybe there are 3 interesting things, but then 3 other people I see on the street outside, and they may just all come up in a combination that will be drawn from the experience of the evening, but won't straightforwardly be it. And so in that sense, it is, you know, every bit of fiction, there's aspects of life and memory and reality and imagined stuff. So that's not a question I could answer straightforwardly. In terms of things that the political aspects, yes, of course, of as somebody who in much of my other life writes about this and speaks about this. That's obviously all stuff that I know and can situate based on conversations, histories, and actual place. There are, I think, there are ways of evoking places that that you have been to, where you then don't have to be there. Right? You may have been there, and then when you write about it, you're reimagining that in your head. And there are I suppose there's a photographic aspect to that memory too when you're describing things.
Okay, someone else had a question. Yes, this gentleman back here. Then, sorry, this lady here.
That's all right.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Get back. Yes.
Hi. My question would be, so thanks Natasha for the presentation and the book. And anyway, so which tense? So future has 4 tenses, and maybe I'm pushing you to be a bit more optimistic because there is future. One of the tenses is I was looking at of course table, and is the indefinite. So it's the idea of memory and identity and selective memory, and how we selectively choose a particular memory that makes us identify with a particular self, and that makes the whole conflict, perhaps individual, social conflict, more protracted and intractable. And so, if that's the case, I think about an indefinite future where things repeat themselves all the time because of this memory. But would you think that there is space for something that can change? And what do you think will be able to make this future perfect? So to make it stop this vicious cycle of memory and identity. That's the question.
It's a very complicated question.
I don't think that I don't know. So grammar, I have a complicated relationship to grammar, which is fun, right? My novel is called Future Tense, but I feel like I know grammar by instinct. If you ask me what I don't know, something about specific about gerunds and infinitives, I would stumble. But the thing about in one of the chapters in the book, there's a can I just answer this question a little non-linearly? Can I just read those lines that you told me because the ones that you thought needed to be read? Okay, I'll just to begin answering that question. Here's the preface. Words. What were they good for? Could anyone build a life from them? Could anyone keep believing in them? Words were overrated. They failed people at specific instances when they were needed most. And so, distances grew between people, and armies are always at war. Because no one can ever seem to find the right sequence of words when they are most needed. So this chapter, in particular, I refer to these lines because that entire chapter messes up the tenses. Because there's a historical memory happening, right? So the tenses keep shifting, and this was an editing nightmare because, of course, the editor wanted to make sure that this wasn't error. But there's a line repeated at the start and the end of that chapter about the disorientation of senses and tenses, and that's actually one of there may be other my definitions of love. That it's a disorientation of senses and tenses. And I feel like some of the most interesting kind of things that happen is in that space of disorientation. So if I try to think of a future, I'm less thinking of perfect futures than to preserve the idea of there being the possibility of having those disorientations of senses and tenses that come from relationalities like love, whereby, and of other people, of other lives, other stories, whereby it then becomes possible to keep hope alive. And I was recently listening to this thing. It was this in-archive story about the philosophy of hope, and some, an academic was saying that you don't hope when you know that something is certain. because when you expect, you don't hope. And you don't hope when something is impossible because you know it's impossible. And and I was just saying to the radio, no, that's not true. Because I don't think that anything is either absolutely certain or absolutely impossible. I mean, we live in a world where everything is always already contingent. So, and as an artist, I want to hold on to that idea that hope is something that you always need because nothing is ever absolutely certain or absolutely impossible. And hope is that space. So when I think of lives that are, multiply complicated by the personal and the political in this kind of very immediate way, as it is for Kashmiris, whoever they are and whichever kinds of Kashmiris they are, then I feel like, or people torn by conflict, then I feel that idea of hope is really important, of being able to continue telling stories so that other realities don't just become abstractions to us, that what other people went through or are going through.
Yes, I think that's interesting because you mentioned this, and I'm glad, Natasha, you read that section, because then it embodies, we've said what are words for, then the next two sentences is, even though that she's doubting the value of words, she's spent the entire hours going through every page of the old journals, jottings and sketches. And what had that given her? So there is that embodies the hope that even though she's questioning the value of words, she's still trying to find something out of them. So I think it's interesting. This lady here, I think probably two more questions because we have got some snacks and drinks and we want time for people to buy books and Natasha will sign them. So let's have these two more questions. This lady here and then you. Yes.
I really want to thank you and I really appreciate your effort to tell the stories that we don't hear in the political narrative. They're dehumanizing narratives, especially in India and Pakistan, and we don't get to hear everyday life stories of people in Kashmir and the way they suffer. So it's brilliant storytelling, and thank you for that. Now, this is also a form of activism where you're challenging the dominant political narrative. I wonder two things. A, whether as a literary activist, do you face any backlash from different actors? So if you could tell us about that and how do you cope with that? And the second thing, second thing would be what would your message be to people like me? I'm a teaching fellow at IOA. And I research on South Asia. So people like me and I also have students who have been Prime Minister fellow in Kashmir. So there is a student concern that we want to do something. So what would be your message? What forms of activism can we adopt without being branded as anti-nationals, but still we bring out the stories of people in Kashmir?
I don't know that's. I don't know if I have a good enough answer to what people can do, because I think that would vary for who those people were, especially their location. Because if they are in places where they could, as you were saying, be labeled anti-national, if they are and physically hurt, then obviously their ways and means of doing this would be different.
And have you faced any backlash?
Sorry?
So about the backlash and how much you get from the media, people really, you just strike them back. The fact that I can see their faces, that smile itself, when suddenly will see that.
Yeah. It's yes. I mean, again, it really depends on the context. Yes, over the years, enormous amounts of hate, vitriol, vicious things, lies, very specific lies, such as, which always amazes me, like the specific lies always amaze me. Like until a few years ago, she was in a relationship with this guy who was, you know, who works at the Pakistani embassy in London, and he's married. What? Like, what? I mean, I am going to the Lahore Festival and I had to go for the visa. That was probably one of the first or only times I actually have been there. So just like, how do you make such specific lies? So there's that. And this person, for instance, in this particular case, was a PhD student in Europe, and with a supporting PhD student. And, you know, so yes, egregious lies, death threats, you know, people writing on your DMs to say, we hope you get crushed by a vehicle, people telling you that you'll get, you know, killed or whatever. So that sort of stuff. Obviously 10 years ago, it was much harder, and I can still remember, I can actually, I mean, there are still sentences that are stuck in my head of such immense physical and gendered hate that I don't think I will ever be able to kind of completely erase that sentence, especially this one particular sentence, from my head. Like it's that level of hate and viciousness. And there are days you break down, as I was saying to Anna, that SOAS thing, there are days you break down and you just feel like, you know, why, how, what makes you lose faith in people. But then you have to just be Sisyphean and you have to just kind of, you know, push the boulder up again. So that's it really. I mean, that's what we have to do. When we crash, and then we just kind of rebuild ourselves. And not just only for activists, as people. That's how we live, right? And again, the same thing in terms of making meaning. We, you know, for those people, wherever we are, it's always possible to intervene into the world somehow. Whether that's at a very micro level or a macro level or a meso level, in public, in private, it's not always possible in every instance for anyone, to always be saying things. People have different modes. But as long as, I think the important thing is, as long as that one has a sense of connection to the idea that one is doing something that is making meaning out of what the world is confronting one with. I think that's really important. Whatever form that meaning making takes, with whatever degree of success, that we cannot predict. We won't know. Whether you can write a book. You hope that it will be read. You don't know if it will be reviewed. You don't know who will read it or what will be made of it. And likewise with poetry, with academic stuff, anything. So there isn't an answer I can give other than to just think, hope, and do whatever one can, wherever one is located physically, but also in terms of one's own life and everything.
I think, and draw strength from other people's efforts and humanity. Because for all the negative, there is positive. I think one or two questions. Maybe we'll take the two together because it's nearly 8:30. Yes.
Hi. I'm halfway through the book, and it's made me dream of Kashmir in different ways because of how clearly and fascinatingly it's been written. So thank you very much for that. There is a certain trajectory that you take when you talk about how people relate to borders, and you contrast that with how birds and mountains and rivers don't relate to borders in the same way. However, then you draw a parallel and talk about home with respect to the clouds and this person who has a home in Kashmir but doesn't remember it anymore. And could you just explore, could you just let me know a little bit more about this trajectory that you took, because it was converging and diverging at the same time, and it was so fascinating.
So the thing about clouds and birds, you're referring to the lake, right? You're referring to the way in which the institutions with which clouds and birds and water process what are borders for people. The other way,
at one time, I think Shireen is sitting in Leh and she's looking up at the clouds, and she basically says, I wonder if they feel the sense of home, or do they feel that they've gone away from home? Have they gone away from home, and in those ways? I'm sorry, maybe I can...
I think I can't remember the thing about leaves, birds, I don't know what, but I don't think clouds. I don't think clouds in that second part. But Yes, so home is converging and diverging both, right? Home is one of those things. It is when you're away from it, whatever it is, and it may not just be a home, it may just be home-like feelings that you get in places that have, fall within the constellation of what home might mean for you, or home might be a very specific place. So it is a place of, there are differential relations to the idea of home. And so that is the case for the characters there as well. I don't know if I'm able to understand.
Yeah, that's okay. I'm going to kind of come back to you.
Okay, do we have one last? I think, this is lady here. There's literally one last question, and then we're going to thank you.
I just wanted to know, I knew when you grew up, you were very interested in writing and reading. So what was your inspiration? I mean, what's the message for for youngsters or children if they want to write, in future or in present? So what message would you give them? Keep on aspiring, writing, or where you get your drive from? It's very challenging.
Especially for children, but also for adults. Miracle, wonder, don't grow up, ever. It's true, it is a con. Look at the, I just feel that it's writing or the very idea of the word, being able to convey anything at all, and let alone for a word to make it possible for us to imagine something, is the stuff of wonder, no less than the stars or anything. I mean, I just think we're not zooming out enough most of the time. No, seriously, here we are. This is a small enough gathering. We can do this experiment, how many, whatever, where all this hall full of people, right? You're all here, but you're also in this kind of, in this kind of strange architecture inside all of your heads. You're also immediately also able to be on that afternoon when you were 5, and on that, and 10 years later, you're something that you might have, you can imagine, and that other time that you really, crashed, and when you were hungry and when you read a book. The very fact that inside our heads, in our imaginations, it is possible to inhabit multiple realities all of the time. I think that in itself is a miracle, and I think children, especially when we read books, it's such a powerful way of being able to see that reality in other people. And of course, we fail at communication, we fail at being generous, we fail at interpretation, we fail in lots of ways, whether we are politicians or people who lead armies or people who run a home or do anything at all. But the fact that it's always possible to then overcome those situations is something that I think literature and stories are really powerful. That sense of imagination. I genuinely feel that if everyone could if people read more poetry, I think we'd have less wars. I mean, no, seriously, I think that is the case. I think that if people read more poetry, there would be less wars. People would if there were, so 2 of my favorite newspapers are the kinds that don't exist. One newspaper is the one that doesn't tell us things based on who's near to us, right? So it's a newspaper that just, on the first page, just has tragedy, and it doesn't matter whether that tragedy happened here or 100,000 miles ago. It just kind of treats all people, regardless of national boundaries, as if they were human beings. I think that newspaper doesn't exist anywhere. And the second newspaper that doesn't exist anywhere is the one that doesn't tell us what's happening today, but tells us something of what happened 2 years ago and why that's still relevant. Because it's as if people only pay attention to something like this when there's a nuclear war, when a bomb has been dropped, when so and so many people have died. And the whole point is that just sets you only react to things when they become terrible. So I think as children, it's really important for us to be, especially for children, to imagine otherwise, to see continuities, and to read. Reading is just so incredibly powerful. I can't think of anything better than reading, and then when you finish the books, you just think of, you then imagine what happens after. So.
Well, I think that's a wonderful note to end on. I've been in conversation with Dr Nitasha Kaul with her new novel, Future Tense. So to thank you all so much for coming. There is time to mingle and purchase.
Thank you so much to everyone who's here, to Victoria, to Anna, to Amina, to everyone who's worked so hard to make all of this happen. They're all stars, really. No, we never do anything on our own. Everything only happens with and because of other people.
And the cash machine is outside. The cash machine is just outside the building.
It's not working. Yeah.